Hi, this is Lili De Hoya Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me for our discussion of Doctrine and Covenants sections 27 and 28 for this week's curriculum. And there's a lot of context to these sections that we're going to get into. I was thinking back to the first time I read the Doctrine and Covenants. Of course, that was several readings ago. And as I've mentioned before, it was when I was 16 years old, and it was our course of study for seminary that year. And although, certainly in seminary, I know we were presented with some context. For some reason, I don't really remember learning a lot about church history that year. So, not to diss whomever the seminary teacher was, I don't remember, but I loved just the doctrine of the Doctrine and Covenants. I loved the language of it, and I loved so many things that were just either new ideas to me. And it's funny to say that because, again, my parents were tremendous gospel scholars and they taught so much just organically day to day in our lives. Nevertheless, there were some things that I guess just reading them in scripture, it was so clear in new ways or details about the plan or details about doctrine that were so exciting for me to read firsthand, and I loved that. And again, it doesn't mean I hadn't heard it before maybe, but I hadn't heard it in that way. I hadn't heard the voice of the Lord through these scriptures, and I was so caught by that from that point on, I was an avid student of the scriptures. I really learned for myself what a treasure they are and have continued to enjoy that throughout my life. But in subsequent times, not just studying the D&C, but teaching the D&C several times as a gospel doctrine teacher or as a seminary teacher or an adult religion teacher, it has become so clear to me how much the context can help. And I've been grateful for the opportunity to review that context every time I've taught and to share it with my own children and with other students that I have had the privilege to teach over the years. So I hope that that's helpful today. These are not long sections particularly, but there is a lot going on in the background that I think really helps us understand better. Now, before I get into that, first I have to express my deep gratitude to those of you who have chosen to subscribe on Patreon. I can't say it often enough. This is allowing me to continue with the podcast, and I am incredibly grateful for your willingness to do that. It is making all the difference, and I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for all of you who listen. I know some of you can't subscribe, and that's fine. I just am really grateful for those of you who are supporting this effort through Patreon. The links are below if you would like to join the subscribers. I do have extra content on there and can get questions also on Patreon. Those can be submitted and I can respond to them as I'm able to go through them. And I do have a couple of posts here from just this past couple of weeks, and I hope you'll check those out if you're interested. Okay, our current event for one of our current events for this week. Oh my goodness. There's, again, I say this every time, but there's so much. I'm certainly not trying to be comprehensive in my coverage of current events, just choosing a few things that catch my eye, some of the many things that catch my eye. This was a letter that was written by the Archimedes Banya Spa in San Francisco to their patrons. Archimedes Banya Spa is a Russian-style spa where, at least in some parts of it or whatever, I don't know all the details, but clothing is optional. So people come and in the nude get into the spa pools and things like that. So here was the letter. I'm not going to read the entire letter, but you just can't make this stuff up. Dear Banya patrons, It has been a long and difficult night filled with reflection on how to best navigate the conversation unfolding around us. We are listening. We are reading the comments, some of them filled with thoughtful perspectives, others with painful accusations, and we want to take a moment to clarify, excuse me, our intentions. Okay, so what are they referring to? Well, they decided to have a women's only night, and women showed up, and so did a bunch, or at least some, I don't have a number, of transgenders. Again, I will not call them transgender women, and I am saddened every time I hear news interviews or whatever where even people who do not buy into the whole transgender ideology and so on refer to men identifying as women, and they use the she, her stuff, that pronouns and so on. And I'm sad about that. And it is not because I desire to offend anybody. It's not because I hate anybody. It's not because I am wanting to hurt. It's because it's not true. And we should be careful about the words we use. They need to be true. And I wince also because I think of how many children who are just trying to figure out the world hear these confusing pronouns and are trying to square that with what their senses tell them. And, I've mentioned this before, but studies have shown that even little babies can tell if they're being held by a woman or a man. So something that is so basic that little babies can distinguish the difference between the sexes, and yet here we're trying to speak in such politically correct terms that we're just trying to confuse, or we may not be trying to, but we end up confusing the innocent. It just is a mistake, brothers and sisters. It's a mistake to buy into that language. This is my opinion. It's a mistake. And in the fairly recent, they came out last year, transgender updates for the handbook of the church, they did say that it was inappropriate for leaders to ask ward members or any stake members or whatever to use particular pronouns. And I was really glad that was included because, people can choose to do it if they want to, but I just think it's a mistake. I think we need to speak truth without the intention of offending, but that doesn't mean people aren't going to be offended. We're actually going to mention that a little bit more in part two. But okay, let's go on with this letter, which again, I repeat, you can't make this stuff up. So they got a lot of pushback because, here there were women who are without clothing in the spa coming to a women's night, and then these biological men show up and want to participate. Anyway, they go on with the letter. We have seen messages claiming that cis women don't deserve space, that asking for a phallus-free environment is inherently hateful. So, okay, let me back up. That's what they did. They responded to the complaints of biological women who had that spa space invaded by biological men on Women's Night. And so then they sent out an update and said, well, we're calling it phallus-free night. Oh my gosh. And now they got this big pushback from the transgender activists and community or whatever, saying that asking for a phallus-free environment is inherently hateful and that any separation is an act of exclusion. This is categorically not true. They said the request for a phallic-free space is not about exclusion. It is about recognizing that some members of our community experience a different reaction to that part of the human body. You think that maybe it's offensive to a woman, at least some women, healthy women, to go into a space where they expect it to be all women, and we're talking about locker rooms and bathrooms as well. And here it happened to this spa. Whether that reaction is based on personal history, trauma, cultural or religious beliefs, or simply comfort, it is valid. So their next move was to announce that they're going to hold 2 women's nights per month, and one of them would be the phallus-free night, and the other one would be for anybody who says they're a woman. They're still not out of the woods. They started to get review bombed on their, website or whatever, Yelp reviews or something, and they got a ton of one-star reviews with a lot of complaints about bigotry and all that kind of stuff. And this new policy of having the 2 women's nights is currently, at least unless I've missed an update, is under review by the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And those groups are notoriously known for pushing the boundaries. So, I mean, brothers and sisters, we talk about this sometimes in social commentary about how at some point the snake starts eating his tail or the tiger starts eating his tail. Like, you can't bend the truth to the point where, without avoiding the point that it's going to break at some place where your logic is going to become so compromised because you wouldn't stand for truth that you just can't go forward. And let me mention again that, I mean, historically in society, it has been sort of a live and let live, like in free societies, do what you want as an adult, but just don't impose it on other people. Keep it out of public spaces or private sex assigned spaces, but what you do is your own business as an adult. And that has been sort of the default for a long time. And while it does allow for a lot of deterioration of morals and values and so on, okay, when we live in a society with people who have different beliefs and so on, we accept that that's part of the deal. But that's never enough for these really militant ideological groups. They keep pushing. They keep pushing so that you don't have to just let them be in their own private lives. You have to allow it into public life and, family-friendly environments, so-called family-friendly, where now they'll have what they call family-friendly drag shows. This is not innocent. Can I just say it's aggressive? Chris always said this, and I think he was absolutely right. Of course, it wasn't just original to Chris. A lot of people have commented in this exact issue that the likely reality is that people who struggle with their own identity in whatever way, it's the whole, you know, 20% of the alphabet that has now been commandeered by these kinds of groups, LGBT, whatever, that they don't find contentment or happiness on their own. And that is largely true. Like, again, I mean, I don't know, all people who struggle with their identity or have claimed a different identity, but there is a lot of evidence that they're not really content with their own life. And why? Because these things don't bring happiness. They're contrary to the nature of joy. They're contrary to the nature of fulfillment and magnifying of our lives. They just are. And again, if you really look at the research, which they don't like to talk about, and it's not public very much, but the suicide rates are extremely high. In fact, some studies have shown that the suicide rates of transgenders are higher than the suicide rates of Jews in concentration camps. Like, seriously? Like, look at that. Now, that's like unheard of. And some people say, well, it's because they're rejected by society, but they have tried to control for that variable. And these studies have asked people who identify as transgender if they feel accepted by, for instance, their family or their work colleagues or their neighborhood or churches or whatever. Anyway, they try to even isolate that variable, and then they look at the ones who feel accepted, who don't feel disrespected or injured or attacked by anybody in their circle of interaction, and they still find these incredibly high suicide rates. So, and this is tragic. Like, we don't wish that on anybody. Nevertheless, what we're talking about are people who are clearly not completely happy or balanced or healthy or able to flourish. And yet, somehow, and this was Chris's point, again, there are others who have recognized and talked about this, that it's almost like they feel that their way of feeling better about themselves would be if everybody in every social circle and every group would validate them. So if I can get you to validate me, then I'll feel better about me, is the idea. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And yet that is where all this aggressive activist push comes from. Like, everybody has to not just allow me to be what I want to be in my private life and in my private spaces, but I need to thrust it onto society in these public spaces and work and church and wherever. And I need everybody to accept me, like it or not. And I need them to feel comfortable with their kids around me and whatever. And we have seen this creep. Well, sometimes it's not much of a creep, but sometimes it is. It's been a creep, and then it's been some pretty dramatic moves that way. So again, I've mentioned this before. I remember talking to a non-member friend who at first was saying, like, well, I don't see a problem with the people choosing to live in these kinds of ways. And I said, again, in private spaces, what an adult does is their business. But I said, look at all the accommodation that has been made. Like, over many years now, we've provided single-use bathrooms in almost every public space that are for whomever wants to use it, and they're private in there. So they don't have to be in a boys' bathroom or a girls' bathroom. They can be in a single-use private space that is specially for anybody who's, like I said, doesn't want to choose one or the other. But that isn't enough. No, now it's got to be in the girls' locker room. It's got to be in the girls' sports. It's got to be in the girls' bathrooms. And they wouldn't settle for what was a, pretty extensive, and I'm sure, cost plenty of money, but they wouldn't settle for that accommodation. It was like, no, we're going to push it. And of course, one of the worst areas where this has been pushed has been in children's classrooms of our public education, where posters all over and teachers' supposed sex education curriculum, or not even sex education, but it just, in the math problems now, it's some of these things are included or whatever, that, trying to normalize this with children who are so vulnerable and so susceptible. And as I said, trying to make sense of their world. And this ideology has been so aggressive in that way that we're really struggling with the numbers of young people who are identifying as one of these confused identity groups. And it has been pushed. Now, I did post a couple of weeks ago now, maybe a week or so, an extra content bit on Patreon about the worth of a soul and how to help ourselves and our children become safer in their sense of self, to really identify their worth and how to heal those things when they have been damaged. And everybody gets hurt in terms of life's journey. We all get at some point injured by somebody's negative feedback or whatever. And I talk about that, but I talk about both. It's kind of a blend of psychological principles, but we finish with gospel truth that really can be applied in wonderful ways to the healing process of those who don't feel sure about their worth or don't feel confident about who they are, or have insecurities and vulnerabilities in that way that make them susceptible to these ideologies. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that we have so many, honestly, just increasing numbers of depressed and anxious young people. And at younger and younger ages, we're seeing measurable and significant increases in depression and anxiety. And what does that do? That allows those children to be more vulnerable to somebody who comes by and says, like, oh, you're not happy with your life, you don't feel fulfilled or content or safe about who you are, maybe you're gay, or maybe you're trans, maybe you're in the wrong body. And these things are so much more attractive in a way to a young child who's not feeling very confident about who they are, because it's somebody waving this big flag saying, here is happiness, here is contentment, here is what you need to feel fulfilled and to feel better about yourself. And they can be very vulnerable if they have been struggling with their identity, as well as, of course, just the tragic impacts of depression and anxiety if it just continues for a long time. I mean, those things should be more situational, but they've become chronic. And now we have people don't just say, I'm anxious, they say, I have anxiety. And that's been a part of our vocabulary now for very many years. The same is true of depression. It used to be, I'm depressed, and now it's, I have depression. We've changed those things in our society in ways that are so now accepted. And why? Because we're not dealing with those issues very well. And I'm not suggesting that those issues aren't real. I personally feel like I'm probably in a stage of depression, which is one of the stages of grief. And I recognize it. I recognize the impacts of that, and I recognize the symptoms, but I'm working through it. And I know that there is a path through and that it comes from an understandable place, but I don't have to land here forever. It may have to run a course as part of the grieving process, but I don't anticipate it lasting forever. And I don't say I have depression. Again, I'm not trying to criticize people who have picked up that vocabulary from our society that uses it as the default now. But I would ask you to consider that. Just consider that. Do we have to own it as if there's no escape ever, that we're never going to get past this? I know it can be a chronic condition at this point, but let's not give up on applying healthy principles to help us recover a better sense of self, a better pathway through. Again, I've talked about this before. Everything's connected in my head, so sorry, I'm going off on this a little bit. But I've quoted before some wonderful authors who talked about how important it is to become anti-fragile, that this is how human beings actually are designed. We are made to be anti-fragile. And this was not a religious author, but the idea was that the way people are built, and children are this way, stress is meant to increase our strength and maximize our capacity. It's not meant to tear it down. Now, we need to protect our children. They are deserving of protection when they are young, but it should be a strategic withdrawal of that protection as they mature. And we want to basically pass the responsibility to them, teaching them how to create their own strength and safety in utilizing the principles of the gospel that tell us who we are and how we can attain well-being and happiness and joy. I mentioned to someone the other day that church's emotional resilience class, is that the name of it? I forget. It's part of the self-reliance program. And they came out with this curriculum a few years ago, and there's really good stuff in there. And every family could go through that for family home evening, or it's part of scripture study here and there. I mean, you can do it very gradually, but like, these are things that are out there because our children are so vulnerable, not just our children, but especially our children. Okay, I spent more time on that than I wanted to, but I think we really need to see the aggressive nature of these ideologies and to take appropriate defensive action for ourselves and our children. If we just are hoping for the best, oh, and I do need to mention another huge correlate with depression in our young women especially is social media. The numbers are clear that social media consumption increases levels of depression, particularly in teenage girls. We heard so many stories from clients and family members, grandchildren, whatever, that when they remove themselves from that, that they feel better. They enjoy life more. They don't have as much heaviness that they're carrying. Anyway, lots of things out there that we can do to not just sit back and hope our kids get through unscathed, but to actually create protections and remedies, because they may already be hurting, but there are things we can do to address that. As I said, there is something on Patreon about self-worth, and it's something I've used clinically forever. And it's not that complicated, but it is important to like synthesize it and look at it so that we can use it for ourselves and for others, especially our children. Okay. Along with this, I do have to mention the depth of this ideology everywhere. I just saw this actually after I had prepared the notes, but I think it was maybe just last evening that I was looking at some things and I think Caitlin had sent me this. It was a clip of a mother at a school board meeting, and she also was on a news interview show. I forget who the commentator or the anchor of that news program was. It was a female anchor, and she featured this mother, and they showed the clip of her at the school board, but this is a terrible story. It happened in Illinois. I don't know if they specified what city it happened in, but she has a teenage daughter at a public high school, and they had a transgender guy. Again, I'm going to say guy, but he's a guy who thinks he's a girl or identifies as a girl, and he had come into the locker room when the girls were changing for PE. So they have this PE outfit they're supposed to change into for gym. And he was there, and the girls didn't like it. So they together, apparently the mother hadn't even heard about this until after the fact, because the girls just talked amongst themselves, these teenagers, and they said, we're just not going to change. Like, we're just going to kind of boycott wearing the PE uniform because we're not going to change in front of this boy. So that's what they did. And they all got called in to the principal's office and told that they needed to go ahead and use the locker room to change, even though they weren't going to take this guy out of the midst. And then not only that, but like the next day that they had gym, that group of girls had gym, that principal was a female principal, and one of the assistant superintendents was there, and some female faculty members were there, who all came into the girls' locker room, and the word they used in the report was forced the girls to change in front of the young man who identifies as a girl. I mean, can you imagine this? They didn't say anything to the parents. They didn't say anything, whatever. And at that point, of course, these girls talked to their parents, or at least some of them did. And this mother went to the school board, but she also immediately went to the principal and all this stuff. And basically, the only option she was given was to pull her daughter from that school and put her in a, related school or close by or something like that. But anyway, basically, you can withdraw your daughter from this class and school, but we don't want to accommodate these girls' need for privacy. Now, can I just say that this is grooming behavior, and grooming, I mean, I hope you're aware of what that term is. It's a terrible thing that is done to children to lower their defenses, to make them accustomed to uncomfortable situations so they can be eventually vulnerable to exploitation. And whether or not it's intentional on the part of the principal and the actual actors in this point or in this story, it is grooming to insist that a girl, singular or plural, who is uncomfortable undressing in front of a male, change her sensitivities. Get over it. And of course, that's what we saw with Riley Gaines and the whole Leah Thomas thing with the swimmer stuff, where they did the same thing. Those girls were college girls, but it was the same thing. They introduced this biologically and fully intact male into their locker rooms. And Riley Gaines has explained this on interview shows in detail, where she said, you may not understand, but competition swimsuits take like 20 minutes to get into. I forget exactly what she said, but it was something like that. Because it takes a long time to get into those because they are so tight and the material is so thin that you're sort of stuffing your female parts into this suit. And you may need help from another teammate to get it on right. And she said, we have practice suits that aren't quite that hard, but the competition suits really take a long time to get into, and you're really exposed for quite a while as you're doing that. You can't like hold a towel up in front of yourself and manage, it's really full vulnerability that way. And when girls complained, they were told they had to go see a counselor who was to tell them that they had to get over it because they were bigots or whatever, homophobes, transphobes. So can you imagine? This is grooming on a large scale. Now, this, by the way, this thing that happened in Illinois with the high school girls happened after the executive order that was written by and signed by President Trump that said that men had to be out of female sports across the nation. And that included private spaces, locker rooms, bathrooms, etc., that are designated for women. And it's just being ignored by some states. So Illinois is one. Maine has had a lot of stories come out of Maine. California, of course, is pushing back. There are some others, but there are some areas of deeply embedded activism in the United States that are pushing back. And it's interesting because like even England, the UK, which is notoriously further left than the US, has pulled back from some of the transgender insistence, because they closed that Tavistock clinic and so on that was doing transgender treatment and surgeries for kids. And they closed it down because finally the pushback was sufficient. But here, even when you've got from the top down administration in this country saying this has to end, look how deeply embedded it is. I do hope we're talking to our children about this. It's such important stuff. And I hope you'll keep in mind that idea and talk to your children about grooming. Because anytime someone tells a child who is exhibiting discomfort because they don't feel comfortable or safe in a certain circumstance, and then they're telling that child, oh, you should be fine, that's grooming. And, I talked about this months ago. I don't think I used the word grooming, but frankly, and I don't believe it was intentional, but asking women in Relief Society to have a man, which again now is clearly against handbook policy in the church, but it, hadn't been written in the handbook yet. And again, I know people feel pressured and they're trying to be sensitive to everybody and whatever, but asking women to have a man, again, bless their hearts. My heart bleeds for people who are confused about their sex and who they are. But to have women put up with a guy in a women's meeting, it's a kind of grooming because we try to teach our daughters and we have to continue as women to take some responsibility for how we feel in certain environments. And again, how many times do we say that, like, gosh, the Holy Ghost can be a prompt to those things, or the Spirit can prompt us to say, hey, I'm not in a safe place. I should get out. I don't feel comfortable here. I should do something about it. I should exit, or I should find somebody to come with me that I know will, provide safety or help me be safe. That's something that we try to teach our children, and certainly our young women. Even our young men, of course, need to know that if they don't feel comfortable or they don't feel safe, they should exit or get someone to help them be safe. Nevertheless, this continues for women because of our physical vulnerability throughout our lives. And now someone is trying to tell them, ignore that. Ignore that feeling of discomfort. Ignore that. Could be the Holy Ghost, could be the Spirit saying that, like, this is not a safe place. But you need to ignore that. That's grooming. Okay, have I gone on my rant enough here? I guess I have. Let's go on. My goodness. I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah, right and left, as Boyke Packer said many years ago now, this is worse than Sodom and Gomorrah because of the internet. So the minute it's one place, it's everywhere. And we certainly see the impact of that in our lives, right? Okay, so let's do some background on this section. We're not going to get too far, obviously, before we go to part 2, but we'll do a little bit to get into the DNC here section. I think I did reverse order. I'm going to do section 28 first, and then we'll come back to section 27. This is from the DNC manual for the Institute, or maybe it's seminaries, but I like it, and I check it every once in a while. It's a good resource. Anyway, Revelation was still a relatively new concept for the saints as the restoration continued to unfold. And I do think that that context is super important to realize that, I mean, it's hard to imagine now because many of us were born into the church or have joined the church at a time where we do have mass media communication. The church has grown sufficiently that we are known and we are, it's not hard to become familiar with how things operate in the church after all these years. We're coming up on 200 years, right? But it was new. Everything was new back then to these church members. And like we said, the saints of the Colesville branch, last time we talked about this, they're like, doesn't our baptism in another church count? It was by immersion. Are we good to go? And it's like, no, no, no. And it required a revelation to tell them, like, no, you have to enter in by authority. We've talked about that, the essential need of the restoration to bring back God's authorized power to perform ordinances back to the earth, and also don't counsel your God. I have a way of doing things, and there's a reason. Anyway, but here we are in this still super early time in the church. They knew that Joseph Smith could receive revelation for the church, but could others as well? So this is such a fledgling organization that people are wondering, like, well, maybe somebody else can get revelation for the church. I mean, he spoke to Joseph. Maybe he can speak to somebody else. Questions like this became critical when Hiram Page, one of the 8 witnesses of the gold plate. So he wasn't just a regular member. I mean, he had witnessed the gold plate. So he was, like kind of a good guy, right? But he believed he had received revelations for the church. So he's seen the sacred nature of this work. He's an eyewitness to the existence of the gold plates that were translated into the Book of Mormon. But he's starting to get ideas, and he thinks like, hey, this is revelation for everybody. Many faithful saints believed him and believed these revelations were from God. The Lord responded by teaching that in his church, all things must be done in order. And that's from verse 13 of section 28. This meant having only one person appointed to receive commandments and revelations for the entire church. And that's right there in verse 2. So we're kind of jumping into this section. Verse 2, no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith, for he receiveth them even as Moses. So God is like clarifying. We've got all these people who are coming to the restored church. I mean, it's still very small, but, it's starting to grow. And this kind of thing is part of the growing pains. Can anybody maybe get revelation for the church? It's small enough that people are going to hear about it, right? But again, in verse 13, all things must be done in order and by common consent. We didn't talk about that last week, but there was a mention of common consent in the reading for last week too, which is, of course, an incredibly important and continuously practiced concept in the church now. It's a pattern of how we do things. So anyway, let's go on with a little bit of the context, though, because it gets pretty interesting to see how this kind of rose up and created a problem and what happened that brought forth Section 28. Now, others, as has been clarified again and again by our leaders, can receive personal revelation for their personal stewardships. And that's something we all can have, as parents, as partners, as Sunday school teachers, primary workers, young men's, young women's, Relief Society, Elders Quorum, whatever it is, leadership positions, we can certainly receive revelation. But if it counters the revelation that the prophets get for the whole church, we're out of line. And that becomes a pretty easy litmus test if we would use it, right? Anyway, in the summer of 1830, so again, April 1830, the church starts as a formal organization, and this is just a few months later. Oliver Cowdery wrote to the prophet to inform him that he felt there was an error in one of the commandments contained in the passage now recorded as D&C Section 20. Now, remember, that was kind of like the first handbook of the church. It has a lot of organizational instruction in Section 20. And Oliver Cowdery writes Joseph and says, I think there's a mistake in that revelation. And Oliver commanded is the word that they use here in recounting this story, the prophet to change the wording. So Joseph Smith wrote this, and this is from the Joseph Smith papers. I immediately wrote to him in reply, in which I asked him by what authority he took upon him to command me to alter or erase, to add or diminish to or from a revelation or commandment from Almighty God. Okay, so this is powerful. Joseph Smith comes back and he says, by what authority are you trying to command me to change or add to or diminish or anything, something that came from Almighty God to me, his prophet? Continuing, in a few days afterwards, I visited him and Mr. Whitmer's family. When I found the family, the Whitmer family, again, these are stalwart members, like these are good people, that family was in general of Oliver's opinion. So Oliver had convinced them that he was correct about wanting Joseph to correct something in Section 20. And it was not without both labor and perseverance that I could prevail with any of them to reason calmly on the subject. So can you imagine? Like, Joseph goes himself to say, like, okay, let's talk this through and make sure we know the order of operations in the church, how God wants the kingdom to move forward. And there does need to be order, right? But can you imagine the chaos? Anybody can get revelation here and there, and people are going to follow. Anyway, we're going to have, a million little sects of believers, right? But look, just in that short time, it took labor and perseverance to prevail on any of them to reason calmly. So we're talking about a really emotional contretemps. I mean, sort of discussion and a disagreement. We're really talking about that. And Joseph is like, okay, no, I'm gonna keep laboring and I'm gonna persevere until I can help you understand. Finally, I succeeded in bringing not only the Whitmer family, but also Oliver Cowdery to acknowledge that they had been in error. Look at the effort involved. Then going on in early September 1830, so that was summer. Now we're talking just a month or so after summer. Another serious challenge to the Lord's order of revelation in the church occurred. As a result of increasing persecution in Harmony, Pennsylvania, Joseph and Emma Smith, and again, we have to remember that all of these revelations are coming at a time where persecution is just scaling up. It's rising, it's mounting in ferocity and intensity. And the breadth of it, like more and more people are attacking this beginning of the restoration. So, there's increasing persecution in Harmony. So Joseph and Emma moved to Peter Whitmer Sr.'s home in Fayette, New York. We mentioned that before. Upon their arrival, Joseph learned that Hiram Page was claiming to have received revelations through a stone. So Hiram Page is the one that was one of the 8 witnesses and that's mentioned in this section. Newell Knight, who had arrived in Fayette to attend the second conference in the church, they were having them every 3 months back then, right? Shared the following. On my arrival, I found Brother Joseph in great distress. This is Newell Knight's account. I found Brother Joseph in great distress of mind on account of Hiram Page, who had managed to get up some dissension of feeling among the brethren. So not only do we have this incredible persecution coming from outside the church, but this is what's happening in the church. Like, think about what Joseph is dealing with, basically in a constant day-to-day way. He just barely is managing to put out one fire, and then here comes another fire that the believers are buying into. So he's dealing with persecution. He has to move himself and his wife to another part of the country to avoid persecution. And he finds that, okay, now the believers are against me because now they think Hiram Page can get revelation for the church. And it concerned the government of the church and other matters, which he claimed to have received through the medium of a stone he possessed. Now, Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim. He used a seer stone. He's, okay. So now he says he has a stone, Hiram Page does, and he's getting revelation through it. He had quite a roll of papers full of these revelations. So he's been busy getting a bunch of revelations, and many in the church were led astray by them. So conflict from outside, conflict from inside the church. Even Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmer family had given heed to them. Now, this is different. Like, first it's Oliver Cowdery wanting to correct something in Section 20, but now it's, well, we think Hiram Page may have a leg to stand on. Although these revelations that Hiram Page supposedly had received were in contradiction to the New Testament and the revelations of these last current days. Listen to this. This is important. Here was a chance for Satan to work among the little flock, and he sought by this means to accomplish what persecution failed to do. So if he can't beat him with external persecution, let me stir up the membership and deceive them so that they'll destroy it from within. What persecution failed to do, Joseph was perplexed and scarcely knew how to meet this new exigency, which means emergency, right? That night, I occupied the same room that Joseph did, and the greater part of the night was spent in prayer and supplication. Joseph's not getting any sleep. He's like, what do I do? How do I address this to keep the restoration going? After much labor with these brethren, they were convinced of their error and confessed the same, renouncing the revelations as not being of God, but they acknowledged that Satan had conspired to overthrow their belief in the true plan of salvation. In consequence of these things, Joseph inquired of the Lord before conference commenced and received Section 28. So, again, context matters. I mean, it really matters. Reading these things as a young person, I don't know if I heard all of those details, but we didn't have the Joseph Smith papers, and we didn't have as much material as we had then. So, no diss on the teacher, but I don't remember, and maybe I just don't remember, but the point is, it really makes a difference as we go through this to kind of understand how tenuous this was, how fragile this was. Now, God is not defeated in his work. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to encounter adversity, that we're not going to encounter external and internal trouble. And I think any of us can look at our lives and our own experiences and we can see that. But recognize that this is always the way. Satan wants to snuff out light. He wants to snuff out growth. So, conference being assembled, the first thing done was to consider the subject of the stone in connection with Hiram Page. And after they discussed and so on, Brother Page and all the members of the church renounced the stone and those revelations. Remember, he had a bunch of revelations that he'd been distributing, much to our joy and satisfaction. So Newell Knight continues, "It was wonderful to witness the wisdom that Joseph displayed on this occasion, for truly God gave unto him great wisdom and power, and it seems to me even now that none who saw him administer righteousness under such trying circumstances could doubt that the Lord was with him, as he acted not with the wisdom of man, which would have been insufficient under such difficult circumstances, but with the wisdom of God." So, pretty important to consider how difficult it was for Joseph Smith and the early believers to progress in the restoration. It was something so new and so different, and line upon line, precept upon precept. Can anybody else get revelation for the church? Here's this guy who's got a stone. He thinks he can. He's not a terrible guy. He's a member of the church. He was a witness to the gold plates, but no. Here comes section, well, I think, did I get that mixed up? No, it was 28, section 28, and and it's clarified. No, but it takes all this effort on Joseph's part, all this blood, sweat, and tears. Persecution from outside, persecution from inside. I'm going to wrap it up here for part 1 and invite you to join me for part 2 of this week's curriculum. Brothers and sisters, we're seeing that now. And I think I'll pick up on that a little bit more in part 2, but we are not immune from, of course, persecution from outside, but persecution from inside. We'll talk about that in the next section. Let us be grateful for the prophet Joseph and understand maybe a little bit more this time around through the D&C and church history what sacrifices were made by this amazing, amazing prophet. And I hope our love for him increases with every word that we read, with everything that we learn. As ever, thanks to my dear husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.